And the record button is smashed. Welcome to Podcast or Spook. I'm your host, James Weeks, and today I am joined by Professor Gary Chartier. Gary, why don't you tell the folks about yourself for those who may not know who you are?
It's great to be here, James. Thanks for having me on. So I'm a philosopher and academic administrator. I'm the Associate Dean of the Business School at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. And I write about ethics and political theory. If you've run across things that I've written, probably the most, the best odds would be that you might have run across my little book, The Conscience of an Anarchist, or the edited collection that Charles Johnson and I did, Markets Not Capitalism. But I've written a variety of books on topics in ethics, in law, and in politics. Most recently, a book called A Good Life in the Market, An Introduction to Business Ethics, and another book called Flourishing Lives, Exploring Natural Law Liberalism. I don't know, I enjoy long walks on the beach and, have cats at home. Not sure what else people might want to know.
Yeah, the Markets Not Capitalism, I know that book in particular has been a great deal of just a help to mine in getting libertarians to kind of expand their thinking when it comes to libertarianism. There's been quite a few people who are like staunch, Ron Paul types who I'm like, listen, read this, please, just read this, and it's completely like opened their eyes a lot to, more left libertarian type thinking. And
I'm really glad to hear that you've been able to share that book with people and that it's been helpful. I think it was a real pleasure and privilege to work on that with Charles Johnson, and I think to pull together a bunch of essays from the individualist anarchist in the 19th century through to today, and really offer, I think, a different perspective on libertarianism's relationship to the status quo.
So, have you always been a libertarian?
No. So I grew up in a way that probably was typical for a lot of libertarians of my generation, which, as I like to say, I read science fiction, I programmed computers, and I was socially awkward. I had parents who were Goldwater Republicans, pretty much, and so I was, certainly influenced by that environment. And in high school, I kind of, I would say, found myself just kind of radicalizing things that they seemed to believe, taking their views to the logical conclusions of those views. And, so that probably drew me originally into the, into the libertarian orbit. And then, I think what happened was that in college, I kind of drifted into probably a fairly conventional variety of social democratic politics. I didn't really think through kind of how the libertarian and anarchist ideas that I explored earlier might respond to some of the concerns that brought people into, kind of social democratic space. And then, as I like to say, George W. Bush and Barack Obama radicalized me and brought me back to libertarianism because, as I really started to think about the truly awful things they were doing, that prompted me to be more of a radical, to seek out more, interesting perspectives. And fortunately, the internet really made that possible and allowed me to connect with people in the, in the libertarian intellectual world, like Roderick Long, like Sheldon Richman, like Kevin Carson, like Charles Johnson. And, I really felt in a sense like I was coming home. Kind of the concerns that had, motivated a shift in my thinking earlier could be incorporated into the, the libertarianism, the anarchism that I'd been sympathetic to before. And so I came back around in that way.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you came back around because your work has been very good to me in my work within the libertarian spaces and in getting people to, like I said, kind of expand their horizons. Because a lot of libertarians, they get especially within like the Libertarian Party space,
Mm-hmm.
get stuck in a very everyone, left to me is a communist type.
Yeah, that's extremely unhelpful.
Yeah, getting them to understand that no, they're free markets are not exactly just one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've also a lot of Voltairine de Cleyre has been really great at that as well.
Yeah.
Especially her one essay, the anarchism from 1901. That's actually the essay that got me to kind of embrace a more anarchist without adjectives type outlook, or because that's where I come from. I don't know how you would fall under that kind of I don't know if you'd fall under that kind of umbrella or not.
Yeah, I mean, I love those 19th century individualist anarchists of whom Voltairine de Cleyre is, such a, I think, remarkable representative. And I think that, while, as we know, in the, post-World War II era, so many people in the American and probably also English libertarian spaces really found themselves in what started out as a kind of marriage of convenience with the right that ended up leading them to actually identify with the right. By contrast, those people like Spooner, like Tucker, like de Cleyre, really were people who were instinctively identified with the left in their own era. And I love the fact that they were people who were enthusiastically engaged not only in challenging oppressive state power, but in rethinking social relations of dominance in various ways, and really interested in better workplaces and better relations, between men and women and so forth. And we obviously wouldn't want to say all the things that they said, but I think there's a tremendous amount to learn from them. And my own preference as regards labels, I guess I like the individualist anarchist label with a reference to that group of people. I also like left market anarchist, but I don't want to be hung up on labels. I just think those are great folks, and I'm glad like you to own them as intellectual ancestors.
Yes, definitely. So when you were you said when you were younger, you kind of dived into a little bit of the anarchist spaces.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and then kind of went away from it and came back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think there would be anything that could have stopped like the going away from it? Like if there was something that someone told you or anything like that that would have kept you on the anarchist path the whole time? Because I mean,
yeah,
you see people today. You see people today that kind of they are anarchist 1 minute and then something else the next. And I've always kind of wondered what would be what would be something that could keep them like, hey, wait, don't leave.
Yeah, that's a really really interesting question. So yeah, I was when I first started to pay attention to political philosophy, kind of toward the end of, middle to end of high school. Who was I reading back then? I was reading, I read some Hayek, I read Nozick, I read Rothbard, I read Robert Anton Wilson. I also read some Rand, though I have to say that Rand never really kind of resonated with me viscerally. There's certainly people like Roderick Long and Nira Badwar, for whom I have a lot of respect, who really have learned a lot from Rand, but she never really resonated with me. It was really kind of the people I've mentioned. And so I think there was a lot of interesting intellectual stuff going on there, but what there really was not, I think, was a very self-conscious attempt, at least in context that I had any access to really talk about the ways in which, the individualist anarchist tradition and its more recent heirs really could be very happily identified with and take on board the concerns of the political left. And I think that would have made a difference, right? I mean, if I had really been in a position to read Roderick Long and Kevin Carson and Sheldon Richmond, then I think I would have taken a quite different view of things. I also think that I was very much alone. It's not as if there was anybody else I knew who was really serious about these kinds of ideas. And I won't say there was nobody who was interested, but I don't think there were very many people who were really seriously engaged and thoughtful where they were concerned, where those ideas were concerned. And so social isolation was probably at least as important as a lack of access to alternative sort of statements of ideas.
So the internet really has kind of revolutionized that in a way, because the access to information and social community.
Yes, both, absolutely.
At anarchist spaces online, and then as well as, like the anarchist library, where you have like literally everything.
The resources to which we have access online now are just phenomenal. And, the good news, of course, is that especially when we're thinking about, about anarchist materials, so much of the anarchist stuff, really is made freely available online. And so I think we benefit from that in a way that it's almost impossible to imagine, being the case in the past. I remember a few years ago checking out of my university library a copy of James J. Martin's Men Against the State, and looking at the library card that was still stuck in the back, and noticing that the last time the book had been checked out was by me, 30 some years ago as an undergraduate. And, it's just, people weren't paying attention to these resources. And now, anybody wouldn't have to worry about that. It'd be possible to just find that stuff so readily online. I think that's a tremendous gift.
That is absolutely hilarious that you were the last person to check it out. 30 years.
Yeah. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Yeah.
Oh, that had to be funny to see. It
was, absolutely.
Oh, wait a minute. But now you can just go to a website and find all kinds of stuff.
Exactly.
You don't even have to go to a library or a used bookstore to find the kind of information anymore. You can just go to any number of websites. A lot of blogs out there. Small podcasts like mine to kind of get some information out there. But so about these long walks on the beach,
Yeah. Candlelit dinners and everything.
We need more long walks on the beach and candlelit dinners in anarchist spaces. It's
that's probably true. I think we probably spend our time doing more of other kinds of things that are more combative and less reflective. But I think you're right.
Yeah, that could. I think all anarchists could benefit from more of those. But we at least we have Facebook.
Absolutely, and for all the things that I think we can rightly gripe about where Facebook is concerned, its impact on my life in terms of just building connections, it has just been absolutely phenomenal. And I mean, so on a personal note, about a little over 6 years after the death of my first wife, I married again in December of last year. And, my wife is somebody I first met in 1989, but we wouldn't have reconnected in a serious way had it not been for Facebook.
Oh, wow.
And so Facebook really, has been tremendously valuable in that immediate personal way for me too. So yeah, I think When I think about what it's done for intellectual community, though, I think that's really remarkable as well.
Well, yeah, that is. It does work for both. Come to think of it, I think my last number of relationships have been relationships that I've that have started from Facebook. Actually,
nice, yeah, that's awesome.
I live on that thing, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. I totally hear you, James.
It's either work or Facebook. That's about it. But the big thing though is that it has allowed, you know, more reach to more newer generations too of anarchists, and it's getting the information out there. Unfortunately, it seems like, you know, you have one thing that's really concerning to me that is the libertarians, especially you know right wing libertarians, the Libertarian Party type libertarians, is they want to shun away, you know, left libertarian thinking and kind of make that go away. And right now, during like with like the success of the Bernie Sanders campaign and you know, people like AOC, where you have a lot of you know, people getting really fired up about the, you know, democratic socialist type. Well, I don't even want to say they're not even really democratic. So it's more social democracy that calls them.
Right, sure.
Call themselves democratic socialists, but with it kind of we have a really good opportunity to recruit and bring in those people, especially because Bernie Sanders is going to get robbed of the nomination again, just like he did in 2016. There's no.
I fear that's right. It certainly looks like they're gearing up to make that happen.
Yeah, especially with like this Iowa caucuses, they're having like some DNC programmer made an app for people to put on their phones for the vote tabulation. Like that's real secure. That's definitely.
Oh yeah, I feel better already.
Oh, thank you. You're gonna stop the Russians. All right. But you know, with them, it seems like they're already starting to go towards, you know, rigging another primary, and so you're gonna have all these, you know, people who were Bernie Sanders supporters that you could bring in and be like, hey, you know, I know you were into the social democracy stuff, but hey, why don't you check out this, you know, libertarian socialist ideas? You know, why don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and it seems like we could guide them into that thinking very easily. And it seems like a lot of libertarians are almost trying to drop the ball on that, because I mean, this would probably be the greatest recruiting opportunity for more libertarians since Ron Paul.
I think it's obviously it really depends, obviously, on how you frame things. But I think about, for instance, the really great things that a number of people, but I'll zero in on Sheldon because he's a close and dear friend, did you know, in the wake of the kind of the first wave of the Occupy movement, and you know, the great little essay that Sheldon did, you know, Wall Street couldn't have done it alone. You know, let's not pretend that there isn't, you know, corporate mischief, but the corporate mischief is tied up with political mischief. And if you want to talk to people about that, you want to make clear to them, you know, what the underlying sort of structural explanation is of phenomena that they're observing. It's not enough to just kind of, you know, be unhappy about the surface level phenomena. You want a deep structural explanation, and I think we can offer that in terms of, you know, kind of sound economic analysis combined with sound political analysis. And just as I think it was possible at that high point of you know, of activism on the left, I think you're absolutely right that we may well be in a position to do that now in response to you know, the resurgence of enthusiasm for you know, for people like Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah, I think you're onto something important there.
It just seems like, you know, you have so many libertarians that are trying to fight against that type of recruiting strategy. You know.
Well, right. I mean, there are too many people who just kind of, even I think smart people sometimes, who really do kind of have a sort of knee-jerk continuing identification with the right, and like this idea of, you know, we're going to own the libs. And I think, you know, that's deeply disappointing to me. But anyway.
Yeah, it does seem that is the primary concern for a lot of a lot of particularly right libertarians is, own the libs. which causes some terrible alliances too. You have
yeah, absolutely. I don't think we want to think that somehow the alt-right is anything but toxic, and I think we want to any kind of ethno-nationalism and indeed nationalism of any kind, I think, is just antithetical to the liberal spirit and to anything I'd want to endorse.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is interesting to see, the welcoming almost of, ethno-nationalist types, while shunning, people who might have some, left leanings, even just slightly left of Pinochet. Like, there's a little bit.
I think
like,
unfortunate.
like you have a lot of people that call there's a number of Georgists within the Libertarian Party.
Yeah,
and you have an entire caucus that has decided that all the Georgists that have been in the party since the 70s.
Oh, absolutely, for decades.
Forever.
Yeah.
They've always been there. That all of a sudden they're communist infiltrators.
Yeah, and I think that's horse hockey. I mean, I think I'm not a Georgist, but I totally respect the Georgists. There's a long intellectual tradition there that really includes or comes close to including somebody as kind of canonical for many libertarians as Herbert Spencer, as well as obviously George himself, who was such a big free trade guy. And I think the idea that somebody would want to read those folks out of the movement or out of the party is just ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. It is. But it's starting to with the growth of the Libertarian Socialist Caucus. It seems like the Libertarian Party is starting to of course there's pushback against that, as of course mainly because of the name. If it would have went with Left Libertarian Caucus or any other, but Libertarian. Now I like the name Libertarian Socialist Caucus mainly because it triggers the right libertarians, so I think that's funny. But
well, so what you're saying is it's owning the cons.
Owning the cons, yeah. Owning the cons is a little bit funny, but so there's there's that growth within the party, which is welcoming of anyone left of Pinochet is welcome in the Libertarian Socialist Caucus. So you have that space available, and there's even anarcho-capitalists who are in the Libertarian Socialist Caucus who may not identify as libertarian socialists, but are allies of a Bonham unity approach to libertarianism, which is starting to take growth within the libertarian movement. And realizing a lot of left libertarians are starting to realize that maybe allying with tankies isn't always the greatest idea.
Oh no, I agree. Absolutely, I wouldn't say that either. I mean, again, there may be tactical cooperation on some issues, say for instance opposition to some wars, but yeah, those can be very scary folks.
Yes. And in past, the tankies, once they got their way, haven't always treated, the libertarian socialists very well. And
just ask Trotsky.
Right, just ends up in gulags or whatever.
Right. Yeah, or against walls.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the Bonham unity approach is starting to grow a little bit more with more libertarian unity across the libertarian spectrum. And of course, on both left and right libertarians, you have people who are opposed to that, but it's starting to grow.
Yeah, I think it's the best way to put this. You pay attention to the history of many different ideological movements, whether you're thinking about the various communist parties, whether you're thinking about fervent religious groups, whether you're thinking about folks with other kinds of ideologically driven preferences, and you find that it's so easy for people to respond with the most vitriol to those who are nearby ideologically, but not identical. And there's something, I think, pathological about that. I mean, I think obviously there are differences that, I might have with this person or that person, and those are worth talking about. And obviously I take the position I do because I think there are reasons to take that position rather than the alternative. But the idea that, the enemy I'm going to train my guns on, if I'm going to use the military metaphors at all, is the person next door, it just seems ridiculous.
Right. The person who's probably the most like the way I've always looked at it, though, and this is kind of what brought me to like the Bonham Unity type idea, is that we can't really know what a libertarian society would look like or could look like because we've not really had it. we've lived under state rule our entire life. So, like, sure, there's been little temporary small experiments in stateless societies that have tended to be, crushed by societies with states. But, within recent history, we haven't seen anything. None of us has ever lived in, a world set free.
Absolutely.
So for us to even try and come up with, and that's what we're always fighting about too amongst libertarians is, this is what a stateless society would look like. But do we really know? Can we know? I don't know. I don't think it's quite possible to come up with all the answers. So a lot of it's like, we know we want to get rid of the state. So let's just, get rid of the system that we have. Let's get rid of this, crony corporatocracy rule, that we have, and worry about, how everything's going to function later. I mean, sure, we can come up with ideas, so we have hypotheticals and all that, but that's all they really are at the end of the day. And it's really silly how much, libertarians and anarchists fight with each other over something that we can't really know because we've never been there.
Well, and I think the idea in any case that you would expect a priori that we'd end up with a kind of uniform model, given everything we know about human individuals and cultures, is just bizarre, right? I mean, so it not only is it odd to think that if there were a single model, we'd be able to be confident what it would be now, but also the idea that we would expect that would happen, right? I mean, I think there's something, I wouldn't cash it, in the way that Nozick does, but I think Nozick's idea of a utopia of utopias with a whole range of different communities working out different ways of being human, I think is immensely appealing and seems far truer to my sense of what human reality is like than the idea that somehow magically a bunch of people are all going to embrace a code and then across the planet they'll all think the same thing. That just strikes me as wildly unlikely. I mean, yeah, I've written a big fat book, Anarchy and Legal Order, trying to argue for what I think would be a great way to organize things, but I have no illusion that anybody out there is just going to take that as a kind of playbook and just follow it to the letter.
Well, that's the new Bible, so...
In my dreams.
But yeah, we'll definitely see competing. A free market would have free market and economic relations. So
right, and in cultural patterns and just a whole range of things. Different people are going to be putting different ways of life on display peacefully. It seems to me, and that's the really interesting thing.
Right. So, everyone could have, there'd be different areas that do things differently. And then you'd, travel 30 miles down the road and you'd probably have, a community that has settled on a different way of anarchying, so you can't have one. I think it is silly to think there's one uniform way to anarchy.
Yeah. I think, anybody who says that, again, I think just has a view of how social evolution works and how people work that's that's just inconsistent, at least with my experience. I think, again, you can make the case, look, there's a kind of asymptotic movement in a particular direction. You can see this as the tendency if you really take a step back, but the notion that at any one time there's going to be, across the board agreement among the kinds of, diverse humans we know there are, just seems bizarre, right? I mean, I think, one of the things, and this goes back to the, the exchange that we had on Facebook a few days ago, and the point I was trying to make, in that, that post from Cato Unbound from a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
I want a world in which people feel more free rather than less free to figure out who they are as individuals and to express that. And if that's the case, then the idea that all of those very, increasingly liberated individuals are going to think that it's a great idea for them to all line up, under exactly the same banner with the same norms and so forth, just seems improbable.
Yeah, I that article was pretty amazing, and I'm really glad to hear that I inspired that. That made me made me very happy when I saw that. That was great.
Should we talk about that so people actually know what we're talking about?
Probably.
Yeah. So, James, why don't you start out by setting the background by telling your side of the story about what you did, and then I'll dive in with how I spun off of that in the article.
Well, I guess I got to kind of talk about the motivations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So coming into the 2016 Libertarian Party convention, I was increasingly being kind of embarrassed by the more social conservative type members in the party, who I would constantly have to, answer for, what's with this, closed borders? What's with this, all this, you want to do all this crazy social conservative stuff. And so as part of the newly minted Audacious Caucus, which had just started, broke off of the Radical Caucus because the Radical Caucus were a bunch of squares. It was decided that I would, strip down to a thong in lieu of a speech during my chair campaign. So I, queued up some music, which, for those that are wondering, I know there's many people who have asked. That was the song "You Should Consider Having Sex with a Bearded Man" by the Beards, which is an awesome, a beard related band. All their songs are about beards, and I happen to have a beard, so it fits.
Yeah.
And so queued that up on the phone and danced around to music, disrobed to musical accompaniment in lieu of my speech, and then promptly dropped out of the race. And that was that. The rest is history. And people made beams of me, and I got death threats, and it was pretty fun.
Yeah, and I wasn't there in the flesh for that, but I certainly became aware of what a remarkable performance that had been. And of course, it got a lot of attention. And I noticed, so I won't try to name names here, but I noticed that there were definitely folks whom I thought of as maybe a little square, who said, what is this about? This is insane. What does this have to do with anything I'd recognize as libertarianism? Nobody's going to think we're capital S serious if we have this kind of thing happening. And so I welcomed the opportunity to write an essay, then the essay that we were just talking about, for a Cato Unbound symposium. Most people probably know Cato Unbound has these symposia every month. Somebody writes a lead essay, and then there's some dialogue, about that. And so I wrote a lead essay with the intentionally in-your-face title, "The Naked Truth About Libertarianism." And I wanted to argue, I think, that a kind of libertarian activism that it wasn't clear to me people were paying enough attention to or taking seriously enough was a kind of activism that recognized the link between embracing the hope for a free society and welcoming genuine human diversity. And, I thought back to the, there's the famous complaint that Ed Crane made about his first Libertarian Party convention. He hadn't realized there were quite so many weirdos. He doesn't put it quite that way. It's more amusing the way he tells the story, but it's clear what he meant. And the way in which the party can be a home for people who really are able to explore in different peaceful ways, very diverse ways of being human, I think is itself a kind of underrated activism. And so as a thoroughgoing individualist, I wanted to embrace that head on, not to see that as a liability, not to see that as, a kind of unfortunate side effect of, being a small party or being an open party, but in fact as something that's really marvelous. And if it doesn't seem, quote, serious, that's because the, quote, serious parties and activists really have tended to want, I think, to be less comfortable with a broad range of ways of being human. And, I want to be part of a political movement that celebrates that.
Right. Yeah, it was really funny to see a lot of like the negative reaction, that it was almost like it immediately separated the wheat from the chaff to me. Like who's the real libertarians and who's not. It made it very easy to figure that out. For one, anyone who's a libertarian that can't spin an act of free expression in peaceful protest into a win for a libertarian argument probably has no business making a libertarian argument to begin with. But also, as far as for my campaign, it was actually amazing. After I did that, because I was running for county sheriff at the time, and I actually ended up getting the Republican candidate who had already hosted his victory party. Because there was but he had already I won the race when he won his primary because of there was no Democrat in the race, but he ended up then accepting 2 debates with me afterwards.
Nice.
And on the second debate, he had to bring his undersheriff candidate in for backup.
Nice.
So I was able to actually get, which has never happened to me. I've never had the Republican accept the debate for me in any of the times I ran for office. They always, my county is a very heavily Republican. If, the elections are decided basically on the primary, and whoever wins the Republican primary wins whatever seat it is. That's just this county. The Democrats don't even bother to run people for most positions, including sheriff. The time I've lived here, I don't think that Democrats have ever ran a sheriff. They've always just the Republicans can have it. So I was like the first person to actually ever challenge the sheriff in the general election, as far as I can remember. I'm sure it's probably happened in the past, but I was actually able to debate the sheriff. And this is a race that libertarians, if you're going to run for office, run for sheriff. Because, for one, you're not debating a politician. You're debating, a cop. Right. And what I was able to do then is twist the entire conversation about the race instead of stupid conversations about, budgets and whatever else. I was able to have an entire campaign where I had the sheriff talk about, civil liberty issues.
Yeah.
And that's what the entire race was about, because there was no Democrat in the race to distract me. And so it was all just civil liberty issues, which of course the Republican sheriff is going to be terrible on. In fact,
Right.
he actually, I actually cannot believe that Republicans actually still voted for this guy, other than they didn't watch the second debate I had with him, in which I baited him into laughing about killing a veteran with PTSD. And
that he had done personally, or the department?
That the department had done.
Wow.
In a question about why they needed their MRAP tank, because of course this
Right. Of course they did.
country small town very small county needs an MRAP for some reason.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
Apparently, I don't know what they're expecting. The law enforcement consists of busting people smoking pot in fields, which is their entire thing they do. But they need an MRAP tank for that. But there was a time, a number of years back, where there was a veteran who was suffering with PTSD, and the local sheriff's department needed a tank to, of course, drive through this, guy's lawn like they're pretending they're in some military and crash a tank into his house and kill him, because he had PTSD and he was having a pretty bad episode that day. And the sheriff laughed about, because they were able to get his family out of there, but then he laughs about, and he's like, and everybody survived, well except the veteran, we had to kill him, ha 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 ha, and I'm
did you censor this? Can I curse?
Yeah, you can curse.
Fuck off. That's what I have to say to anybody who takes that kind of stance. I'm amazed that somebody would treat a human life that casually. That's just disgusting to me. I'm really sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's why I was shocked that he was able to actually, still win. Because you think Republicans voters would, they tend to do the support our troops thing, but apparently the troops aren't as important as the thin blue line type mentality to the Republican voters in Livingston County.
That's just so profoundly hurtful and disappointing that somebody would take that position. Wow, I'm glad you were able to get him on the record as taking that stance.
Yep. So that's why libertarians need to run for sheriff, because they can do that and kind of expose that type of thinking, and they have to strip down to a thong on C-SPAN in order to get the Republicans to agree to debate them as well. So I'm hoping that in Austin, I'm going to see a lot more thongs walking around.
Seems like a good strategy.
Yeah. It's a proven strategy. It works.
Right. We have evidence. And not to mention, the libertarian candidates did better than they ever did before. So, and any argument that it hurt the party, I don't think is backed up by anything. Who knows? Gary Johnson might have won. Right. That was the main factor. Yeah.
A lot of people have thought that was actually in protest of Bill Weld, and I want to kind of clear the air for those listening. That plan was in motion before Bill Weld had even announced. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that.
Good to know. I don't think I'd ever heard that particular interpretation, but good to have that on the record.
Yeah, there were a number of crazy conspiracy theories about that.
Well, glad to give you the opportunity to dispel some of those.
Oh wow! But bringing it back to let's bring it back to how can we get more anarchists in existence with our current political climate that we have. Of course, with Trump in office, that should be pretty good for us. With the Democrats rigging their primary, that should be good for us. What would be kind of the way to really get these people to finally realize that, hey, the government doesn't really give a fuck about us. The corporations don't give a fuck about us.
No. Yeah, I'm the last person to claim any tactical expertise, right? I certainly don't think that I'm going to be the best person to go to for a strategy there. But all I could guess I can say is this: that it seems very clear that right now we've got an administration in Washington that likes the naked exercise of power, and we see that manifested in multiple ways, whether it's the imposition of crippling sanctions on Iran, or the detention of kids at the border, or interference with open trade. We see somebody who likes to throw his weight around, and who in effect has taken the mask off, right? So if there's one gift that the thuggish Donald Trump has given us, it's making it impossible for anybody to view the presidency as an inherently civilized institution. And so I hope we're in a position to keep saying to people, I think this is the clear point that the savvy commentators make, that look, when you look the other way, when your preferred candidate or office holder exercised power in a dodgy way because you fundamentally liked and trusted that person, ask yourself, how do you feel now that it's Donald Trump exercising that power? And can you begin to see that dynamic at work more generally? That there's a ratchet effect, as the great Bob Hicks has pointed out repeatedly. You never see a reduction in power. There's always an increase in power that state officials claim. And if you don't see somebody like Trump using that power in a helpful way, and indeed very much the opposite, see it being used destructively and violently and brutally, then recognize that if there's not a response to the systemic problem and not just to the individual miscreant, then you'll see somebody who's superficially more civilized following Trump, but exercising all of that power and more. And so I think it's kind of using this current situation as a way to expose the dynamics of power that's important. And then, as you rightly note, for people, let's say, who are enthusiastic, supporters of more edgy candidates on the Democratic side, to see how those candidates are marginalized quite deliberately by a party process that is indeed structured to promote the establishment viewpoint. That too ought to be a very helpful way of calling people's attention to the way the system actually works, and noting the degree to which, with some exceptions, when it comes to the things that matter most, and I guess to me those are issues of war and peace. Also noting the way in which the primary voices in both of the mainstream parties, really end up supporting saber rattling, supporting violence. You notice that Trump got the most support of his first period in office when he used military force in Syria. And Fareed Zakaria famously said, "Tonight he became the president of all Americans." And so when you start to see how much the political establishment, creates the illusion of division, but really is united in support of the warfare state, that's another factor that's relevant. So power gets worse every cycle, number one. Number two, as the Democratic primary highlights, the party machine can be used to exclude dissenting voices. And then three, look at the way in which everybody gets on board for war, and you'll see something about what's really going on by way of uniting establishment groups that create the illusion that they're really different. So I guess those are the things I try to highlight about the current political environment.
Right, and it was especially when you have like the Democrats and the Democrat controlled their puppet state media. They're telling you that Donald Trump is an asset of Russia and compromised and all this kind of stuff. At the same time that they're voting to authorize all of Donald Trump's defense spending bills, giving him all the extra money he wanted, more money than and so it's like obviously they don't really think that, right? I mean they can't. It would So it really shows that that's all a part of the show too.
Absolutely,
because they're not. If they actually believed that Donald Trump was a compromised and an asset of Russia, they wouldn't authorize all his military spending. But they do.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. It's clear that what really matters to them is, on the one hand, scoring partisan points, and on the other hand, continuing to feed the military-industrial complex.
Continuing to feed the wars that has been going on. I mean, we've been at there. People today are serving in a war that they weren't even born yet. When it started. And,
absolutely, it's so disturbing.
And it's absolutely ridiculous that this war is still going on, and they constantly add more countries to it under the umbrella of the war on terror. They go and bomb everybody. Spend millions of millions
of dollars a day, James. Yeah. Millions of dollars a day. That's the shocking thing.
And meantime, they're talking about we can't afford food stamps.
Right. I mean, it's just and it's absolutely bizarre that and indeed the Democrats who claim that they do in fact favor, let's say, this or that, government social service program, nonetheless are right up there with everybody else still voting for, the investment, quote unquote, of your money and mine and everybody else's in these wars. It's the war really is the national religion of the American political class.
It really is, and it's absolutely disgusting how much they cheerlead these wars, and how much Donald Trump he got into office talking about it. It makes me wonder, because he got into office, talking against the war when he was campaigning. He he didn't seem like he was going to get in there and be a giant warmonger, and all leading up to it, he was, accusing Obama of, wanting to start a war with Iran to get reelected. And then what the hell's Donald Trump doing? He's trying to start a war with Iran to get reelected.
Absolutely. There's something really bizarre about that. I mean, and I don't have any sort of ability to get behind the curtain here, right? I don't know what's really going on, in the halls of power. But all I can say is I remember spending 8 years watching the misbehavior of George W. Bush, watching the warmongering crap of George W. Bush, who had, of course, campaigned saying he supported a, quote, humble foreign policy, and who gave us pretty much gave us the exact opposite of that. And then, thinking, this guy's crazy and dangerous, and of course is surrounded by crazy and dangerous people. Well, if I had been actively trying to figure out what the perfect anti-Bush would look like, straight from central casting, I couldn't have done better than Obama. And so here comes Obama, framing himself as the peace candidate in contradistinction to Bush, who then comes in and ends up serving Bush's third and fourth terms. So I give, I guess I would say, it's not that Obama never made a good call. I think the creation of the Iran nuclear deal is probably the single best thing he did while in office. And I'm glad that while he wasn't consistent on this, he at least decided he wasn't going to send U.S. arms to the Ukrainians. But in general, he was running the wars just like Bush had been. He, of course, murdered a U.S. citizen without due process by drone, and somebody in his ambit joked, well, he should have gotten a better father, and so forth when Alaki's kid was killed. I mean, it's just, what you see is there's a superficial difference. And then, by contrast, you see people actually behaving in the same way. So, is Trump exactly just repeating what Obama did? No, he's made things much worse in Iran, for instance. But he did absolutely, in a different idiom, but try to make this case that he was not the same kind of internationalist warmonger that his predecessors had been, and then we in fact see him doing even more of the same. So I think you're exactly right. There was that study that you probably remember from right after the 2016 election, where people did some very thin slicing analyses of district by district votes and concluded that there had been noticeable upticks in Trump support in those districts in which people had lost more residents to the wars. And I think people really were kind of taken in by that rhetoric. And I can only hope they're seeing that that was BS now. But anyway.
Right. Yeah. It really makes you wonder, because what was it? There was a. Oh, geez, I'm blanking. I always do this. Anytime I'm trying to think of a comedian's routine, I immediately blank on his name. And it never fails. Every time I'm trying to think of... Oh, geez. I'm not even going to say it because I'm going to be really embarrassed that I forgot his name.
You can edit that out.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, forget it. All right. I'll say the joke. People will message me afterwards and be like, "I can't believe you forgot his name." But there was a joke that a comedian did who I just had a complete brain fart and can't remember his name. But it was that after every president's elected, they're taken down into down into a basement somewhere, and they got a movie projector up, and it's all dark, and they got people sitting all around, and they play the JFK assassination from a different angle, and they're just like, "All right, you got any questions? All right," and they just walk out of the room. So it really doesn't matter, what they get, what their campaign promises are. It seems almost like that's probably pretty accurate, because no matter what they campaign on, it's always the same thing. It's always, doing whatever's beneficial for the corporations, continuing the wars, which is of course beneficial for the corporations. Right. It's all whatever's in the best interest of that, no matter what they run on, what their campaign planks are. And even if they kind of fulfill one of their promises, it's always in the worst possible way for the people and in the best possible way for the corporations. I mean,
fancy that.
It's amazing. it's always that way. There's no instance I could think of that wasn't the case, where they just didn't do pretty much the exact opposite of what they campaigned on. Not in my lifetime. Not in any history I've read. Even going back to the very beginning, what was it? The Revolutionary War. They fought a war over a 3% tax on tea, and then what's the first thing George Washington turns around and does? Institutes a 25% tax on whiskey, and then sends the troops to go shoot a bunch of mountain men for brewing whiskey without paying the tax. So going all the way back, it's never. It never seems to be what the ruling class says is going on. That's all. Seems like it's all just a giant trick, and the people in power just continue getting more powerful.
Yeah, I encourage people to take a look at a book that needs to be brought back in print. And I've actually tried to figure out how
Bill
to make
Hicks.
that happen and haven't.
Jeez, oh, Pete.
Bill Hicks.
Yeah.
Okay. Bill Hicks. Anyway, Carl Oglesby. If anybody doesn't know Carl Oglesby, he was president of Students for Democratic Society. Went on to write about a variety of interesting things. But one of his early books was a book called The Yankee and Cowboy War, and he uses the ideal type of the Yankee and the cowboy to represent kind of two different factions of the American political and economic elite, and suggests that we can see a lot of developments in post-World War II American history as reflective of tussles between these factions. And I think it's a kind of helpful reminder that there are in fact different factions of the American political and economic elite. They have shifting alliances with each other, but they're all on the other side from us. And that's really, I think, the thing to recognize, that it might well be that at the margins, therefore, there might be different constituencies. It may be right now that, let's say, for instance, for the Democratic leadership, we're talking about support from Hollywood, from Silicon Valley, and from Wall Street. Where for Republicans, we might be talking more, let's say, about some Midwestern manufacturers who've long been a base for Republican support. And that's going to lead to some differences on the margins from candidate to candidate, and it can help create the illusion that there's a radical difference, when in fact what often happens is that the real similarities, and again, as you say, support for the well-connected corporate class and for the military-industrial complex persists day in, day out.
Mm-hmm. Well, there may be some minor differences in some domestic social policies.
That's yeah.
But even then, it's not that far different. I mean, what do you have in 2008 campaign? You had Biden and Palin during their debate.
Mm-hmm.
Where they both said they were in total agreement about LGBT same-sex marriage rights.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I agree. There are not many gaps there, and so it's just funny that people really have this illusion that there are big differences, and each side convinces its base that it really is passionately loyal to that base with respect to whatever issues people in the base care about, and then of course it just blows them off when push comes to shove.
That is the truth. And the Libertarian Party has been the only party that since its founding has stood for LGBT rights.
Amen to that. Yeah, something I think we should be proud of.
And not to mention that we are the part. We just got the a plank passed this previous convention, calling for sex worker rights, which was a huge win to get ahead of that. Very many the two major parties are very far behind on that, especially with them both supporting the FOSTA-SESTA stuff, which I've talked about talked about previously on this podcast. But they're so ahead of the curve on that, and so people that are looking for something, of course, the big problem though is with the United States, even going through the political system, the United States being a two-party system, which it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy how much the illusion of choice that we're given to with the two major parties, and there's like the way the laws are structured, there's like no possibility for a third party to come in. It's just, the thresholds needed for ballot access, and then of course you have the attitude that the mainstream media likes to put out that any vote other than Republican or Democrat's a wasted vote. So like that entire process is completely meaningless. So of course the Libertarian Party only really exists as a soapbox, but it's still a soapbox. It's a pretty nice soapbox.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got so it's the ballot access stuff matters, the attitude you get in newspapers matters, but also I think, look, as long as you've got single member constituencies and first past the post elections, it's always going to be the case that people will find it most rational to end up supporting one of the existing parties. I mean, I think as until you change the electoral system, that's, I think ultimately going to continue to be the pattern you observe. And, I don't have the view. So I'm not the sort of person who thinks that, as certainly some anarchists do, that, anytime you vote, you're somehow endorsing the system. Of course, I don't think that. I think you can be much more selective and much more defensive in the way you vote. And I think there's value to a political party organization that's quite independent of the prospects for elections. Certainly when Rothbard and others really were thinking about what they wanted to achieve with the LP 45 years ago, they were thinking first and foremost about the fact that if you've got a party, Rothbard I think also just liked to play party politics internally, but I think there was the idea that you really can use, as you say, the soapbox opportunity to share ideas and shift the Overton window and change the conversation. And sometimes that happens more effectively than other times. And I'm going to continue to urge more stripteases.
Wonderful. Where can people find more about you, more your work? Where can they find out all your stuff? Where can they get your books?
Yeah, so probably the simplest way to handle that is going to be to check me out at GaryChartier.net. That's GaryChartier.net. And you can, that's, I guess, mainly set up right now, to help with kind of speaking and coaching and so forth that I'm interested in, but also you've got a list of my books and a list of a lot of publications there, and also ways to contact me. And so, definitely glad to hear from people and pass on things I've written and so forth.
Wonderful. And thanks for coming on the show here. And for all those listening, hashtag please donate, all the stuff I'm supposed to say at the end of a podcast. And make sure if you're interested in joining the Libertarian Party, you want to help take the party back from the paleoconservatives, go to lp.org/podcast titles or spook, join through that link, and a portion of your portion of your membership dues comes back to the podcast. And then, of course, I go ahead and just donate that to awesome libertarian candidates because I don't really care about making money off the libertarian movement. So I am just donating that to sweet candidates like Vermin Supreme. So basically, joining the Libertarian Party through that link is just like donating to Vermin Supreme. So make sure that you go ahead and do that. And, hashtag please donate, join to the Patreon, all that kind of stuff. Whatever. Nice spooks, nerd.